It's with a really great pleasure to formally launch James's book, English Convents in Catholic Europe from 1600 to 1800. The book looks at 22 English convents on the continent, founded from 1598 onwards, and places their history within the broader context of the Catholic Reformation in Catholic Europe. I won't try to say too much more before bringing James in. And James, maybe you could start by physically showing us the book and telling us about the picture on the cover.
I certainly can. Luckily, I have one handily to hand here. You should be able to see the image there, which I have to say I'm very proud of. I'm very grateful to the community who allowed the use of this image. So that's an image of Mary Aloysia Joseph Wright, who was a member of the English Canoness of the Holy Sepulchre in Liège. And I suppose in some ways she sums up a bit of the book, because she was part of the community. She joins in the second half of the 18th century, but then she moves back to England when the community does, in the face of the French Revolution and the associated anti-clerical violence that goes with it. And she actually dies at Newhall, just outside Chelmsford in Essex, which is where the community was based. And that portrait is still with the community now on their wall. And of course we work, as some of you will know, we work closely with the Canoness of the Holy Sepulchre as well. So I see that Cormac is here, and he is at the moment the Sepulchring Fellow, looking at this very period of their history, actually.
Thanks, James. Can you tell us a little bit about why you wrote this book?
So, I suppose this is to go back actually to in Stephen's little overview of my own personal history, is that I'm perhaps evidence of how sometimes you can be in the right place at the right time and speak at a conference. And at the conference I spoke at, Caroline actually came up to me, so Caroline, who's here, and said, would I like to apply for a job, which of course I did, being coming to the end of my PhD. And so I joined the Who Were the Nuns project. And I was supposed to be there for 6 months, but I stayed for 5 years. I think I ended up with squatters' rights somehow. And what I would say about that project is, apart from the fact it was a huge success, and there's also been a general groundswell of research, which I'll mention, that comes afterwards, but that I do actually, and it's worth saying here, I do owe a lot to Caroline here, that she trained me up and mentored me. Now that's also a way of saying that if you don't like the book, you can blame Caroline rather than me, and blame her for unleashing me effectively on all of you. But you know, it was a great experience to work on that project, and it really gave me a taste of what was a unique early modern movement. So kind of when I was doing my PhD, people would always just say, oh, and a daughter joined a convent, and that was about as far as it went often in the mainstream historiography. But quickly, you know, it became obvious, and it was the case, that the English conventual movement was unprecedented. Nobody else matches this in early modern Europe in terms of a conventual movement. And on a personal level, one of the things that really drove me to kind of look at this and begin bringing it and give what I hope is an entry point, and to show all the research that's being done on it, because there is a huge amount of research being done in different fields, history, literary studies, and so on, was that I actually went to visit one of the communities, one of, if you like, the communities that was still existing, who'd been founded on the continent. Now, it's worth saying that this community was in Darlington, which is where I got sent. Caroline, as the project manager, went to America, but I settled for Darlington. And I was very lucky that I went there, and they were founded, the community in Liège, a Carmelite community, in the 1640s. And I had to go into enclosure they allowed me. I had to be hidden away from most of the community. So it was a tremendous atmosphere. But the thing that really struck me was the archivist's sister, Sister Kathleen, showed me the profession book. So this is what all of them would sign their professions when they joined the community. And she showed me the very first one from the 1640s in Liège. And then she whizzed along through the book and she said, and there's me. And, you know, we hear all the time about living history, but nobody's mentioning them. That is living history to all intents and purposes. So that was my motivation of getting interested and then writing this book.
Thanks, that's fascinating. What would you say you're trying to do in the book, trying to show in the book as a whole, if you had to capture it in a few sentences?
So my motivation was to plug the convents back into, if you like, their own context or world. It's almost frequently forgotten in some ways, because it's taken as a given that they were Catholic. And sometimes we take that for granted and forget it. But actually what I wanted to do was put them back into the world of the Catholic Reformation, but also the other movements that they were plugged into, like the Enlightenment, and also how the Revolution affected them. And to look really, rather than define them by just either in terms of their gender or in terms of their nationality, to instead look and define them and reorientate it towards Catholic Europe and what that meant for them. And they were part of the global transnational church. And so I wanted to foreground this religious element to them, and that they weren't there just because they wanted to write or because they wanted to manage finances or whatever, although they did that. They were there for, first and foremost, was because of their Catholicism, their faith. And so what I wanted to do with the book was to structure it that, to take the reader, if you like, through the experience of what it would have been like to be one of them, from entry to the convent, life in enclosure, from the nun surroundings, to, if you like, the liturgical life of the whole enterprise, how it was funded, and then also their wider place within the Catholic world, which is hopefully what I've done. The big thing was to put them back into it. And if you want to broaden it out perhaps a little more, is that it's part of efforts to de-center the Catholic Reformation, which we talk about, to see how these Englishwomen were actually major players within what's a big global movement in their own right.
Right, and just one last question that I'll ask James. Can you sort of place this in the context of what's going on in scholarship today? Is your book part of a new movement or a new paradigm? How does it fit into the historiographical context of today?
So I think it's fair to say that History of Catholicism in its own right is at the moment going through something of a boom period, that it's very trendy, and even more so with the history of British and Irish Catholicism, especially the early modern bit. And we can see that with, you've mentioned, for example, the conference that's run with the University of Notre Dame and Durham, the Early Modern British and Irish Catholicism Conference. There have been major research projects. It's also worth mentioning that John, who's here, is my co-series editor for the Oxford History of British and Irish Catholicism, which I think it's fair to say is something of a watershed moment for the subject that we've got there, and that this is happening and showing the amount of research that's been going on. It's also worth mentioning that the History of British and Irish Catholicism is getting 5 volumes. The History of Anglicanism got 4. So you can view that how you want to in terms of importance. But if we want to perhaps just look at it on a broader scale of how it fits in, when I did my PhD and I was working early modern English Catholicism, I was quite lonely that not many people were doing it. Now there are a lot of people doing it. It's seen as a big project. A lot of this because a lot of the archives are coming to light, like of religious orders. And what I just want to say in terms of history of women religious, that is within its own right a hugely significant area within it. So there's a research network on the history of women religious in Britain and Ireland. And just to give you an idea of their importance to the national, international story, that a few years ago there was a documentary on BBC 4. And BBC 4 should survive, I'll just say that, you know, it's a great thing. But it talked about women writers in the 17th century, and they were going about how they'd found 3 English women writers. If you go on the continent, there's thousands of them in the convents, but they've been lost from that story. And so that's why it's so important to reintegrate them and bring them back to the foreground. They were pioneering female education.
I'm going to hand over now to Dr. Caroline Bowden to just say a few words about her thoughts about the book.
Hello, everyone. I hope I have it as on the screen, this image, rather beautiful image of the English convent Bruges for you to think about as I talk. And quite by coincidence, you will find that some of what I say sort of reinforces what James was saying earlier on, and also Karen. But I hope you will allow me to repeat my version. And I first met James also in 2008, and at the time I met him, he was deep in discussion about the relic of Edward Olcorn's eye at an exhibition in Liverpool. Not many meetings are quite so memorable. nor do professional encounters often prove to be quite so fruitful, enjoyable, or long-lasting. We went on to work together, as James said, on the Who Were the Nuns project for nearly 5 years. I was delighted to be asked to participate in the launch of James' what I think is a terrific monograph. Thank you, James, for the invitation. I was aware of the need for an overview of the whole period as we completed the research project back in 2013. But when James went off to search for monks on his own project, I feared that he might be lost to the world of exile convents. However, I was thrilled when I found out that he was beginning to work on this overview, and later that he had a contract from CUP, and you've all been introduced to the book already. In these brief comments, I want to quickly review the historiography to show the book's ancestry before pointing out just a few things that I think are really important about James's book. Claire Walker's monograph, based on 10 convents in the 17th century, was a milestone in 2003 and is a volume that continues to be quoted today. From 90 years or so before that, we had the CRS collections of documents, Gilday's magnificent overview from 1914, and some community histories, mostly written in-house. Then we have to leap back to the 21st century, when Laurence Lux-Sterret wrote about the Mary Ward sisters, Nikki Hallett, a literary scholar, wrote about Carmelites. Brigittine scholars were prolific in this period, and gradually others were joining in on both sides of the Atlantic. However, I do think that the AHRC funding that we got in 2008 for the Who Were the Nuns project did radically change the scale of what was possible. James has referred to that. James was at the heart of the work of the project, not only generating data, but investigating manuscripts, working with communities and building up trust. We were very fortunate that all this coincided with the use of digital cameras and the agreement of the communities to allow us to take images in their archives. The burgeoning field of early modern nun studies brought in new scholars such as Jamie Goodrich, and was boosted by new networks such as the History of Women Religious of Britain and Ireland and several PhDs. Sadly, as a counterpoint, it has also been a period of declining numbers in communities and closures, raising questions about maintaining archives and books. On the positive side, the initiatives by 2 university libraries, Exeter and Durham, and the new library that Abbot Geoffrey Scott has created at Doway have all played significant roles in preserving the heritage of the English convents in exile. The editions of convent manuscripts, the books, chapters and presentations that appear in increasing numbers continue to raise awareness of an extraordinary period in the lives of the communities, enclosed or unenclosed. Nuns now appear in most essay collection volumes relating to early modern English women, not just the ones on religion. But there remained a gap awaiting an overview of the whole exile period to provide a framework for all this. Until now, that is, James picks up on so many of these writings in his work. He adds his own archival discoveries and, most importantly, develops his own arguments. His theme is set out in the title English and Englishness, and they are to be defined and discussed and set in the context of counter-Reformation Europe. The discussion as to whether Englishness was more important to the identity of the communities than the Catholic faith, as seen in the reforms of the Counter-Reformation, runs through the chapters. James clearly demonstrates, and he refers to this himself, and it became obvious to me that he's really been successful in doing this. He demonstrates that the faith of the women who entered needs to be placed at the heart of their endeavors. It is their faith which allows them not only to embrace enclosure positively, but to create vibrant communities, able to attract recruits in challenging circumstances. In our troubled times, struggling with rather flimsy regulations for lockdown, this enthusiasm for enclosure seems hard to imagine. Situating the convents in their European context, I think, is one of the great strengths of the book. The description of them, the convents, as islands of Englishness has to go. This is a historian's book, written by a creative historian who reads widely and has pushed boundaries in the topics he covers and his interpretations. I'm sure you've all seen the topics from his chapter headings, and he's referred to them, and I'm sure they will come up again. James has included material from all of the convents and from outside, and he's covered the whole period. That's a real challenge, I think. So many convents and over 200 years. I thought I knew the ground pretty well, but James has found material that was new to me and illustrates convent life in new ways. It's an important book. It's one that moves easily between the small but telling examples and the bigger picture. I have thoroughly enjoyed reading it and at the same time learned a lot. I think it's one which will stand the test of time and provide food for thought for generations of future scholars and for all those interested in the early modern English convents in exile and how they fit into the European context. Congratulations, James. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Caroline. We'll maybe go straight into some comments now from Professor John McCafferty from Dublin.
I was, Caroline had that arresting story about Edward Oldcorn's eyeball. I'm afraid my experience of Edward Oldcorn's eyeball was quiet and solitary veneration. But it did get me wondering about how long I knew James. And I can't quite pin down the moment that I first met James. I often feel like we get on so well that I've known him all my life, but that would be an insult to him because he's so much younger than me. So I couldn't possibly have known him all my life. But the one thing that struck me when I was thinking about what to say was something from my very favorite piece of scripture, the synoptic accounts of the Transfiguration, was where Peter says to Jesus, and I use the Douay Reims for this because I wanted to have an authentic English Catholic voice for my understanding of this. Peter answering says to Jesus, Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. And James, it is good for us to be here. And I think it's a tribute to you that so many people are here. And I don't, just because it's always fun to have bits of scripture to throw and then talk about in a completely secular way. I don't do that just for fun, but I do it because I think I would like to touch on something that I think is really, really important about James's book and that Caroline has talked about too. Now, when you open James's brilliant book, and I'm going to wave it around here to encourage you all to actually get a real hard copy because it is quite a beautiful artifact. When you open James's book, it begins with an introduction, and the introduction is amazing, as he calls it, the litany of success. So he talks about how these women around Percy come to the continent and do something that's illegal in their own country. And then he talks about one convent after another. And that's one way to do it. And maybe that way of doing things chronologically has cut us off from the transcendent aspect of what's going on here in the foundation of these convents, because he then moves into, and I think it's one of the cleverest things about the book and what for me makes it such a compelling book, is he moves then in, as he said himself, into the life experience of each of the vowed religious as she moves through her life in the convent. So the book is thematic and covers a fairly large slice of time, really between the end of the mid to the end of the 16th century and the French Revolution. So it's a good long, slice of time. And one thing that James brings out, and I think is very, very important, well, there's lots of things he brings out that are very, very important, but I thought I would talk about one thing in particular. And again, Caroline has touched on this, and this is the business of enclosure. Because the English women were famed for their enthusiasm for enclosure. And it's quite clear. And he has this great comment on page 190. See, I've been doing my reading. He says, and I think it's a great throwaway comment, the women were there because they wanted to be. So to go back to my first comment, it is good for us to be here. They were there because they wanted to be. And I think that's a really important and profound insight from a professional historian. Their willingness to be there, or to use the language of religion, their vocation to be there. And I think that is the other great triumph of James's book. He's not afraid to use the language that the women themselves spoke. And I don't mean English, and I don't mean Latin, and I don't mean the languages that they acquired when they were on the continent, but the language of the faith itself. And he's handling it delicately and critically. You know, he's not a recruiter for convent life, though I suspect that might be part of his dark purpose. But he's critical, he's a good historian, he's an excellent historian, and he's doing that respectfully. So I think one of the things the book brings out is, and it goes to his discourse about these women transcending their nationality and being part of a wider Catholic Church, is it brings out two things: the serious centrality of prayer in the convents and the central seriousness of prayer in the convents. And they're not quite the same things. And that these women believed that they were participating in the mission to England in the same way and in direct support of their male counterparts, that they believed they would be ready with their boots on or their sandals on or whatever it is to go ashore and be ready for the reinstitution of Catholicism in England. And the way James deals with that and handles that, I think, would make it clear to even those who have a heart of stone, or a secular heart of stone, if you like. It would give them an insight into what these women were about and what they were trying to do. And I could say a lot more about the range of this book, about the scope of this book, and as Caroline said, this harvest of materials that James has brought in. I mean, the book itself will stand the test of time because it encompasses so much. But I also think, like all really, really good books, it sheds something, it sheds a little light on the character of the author. And I found there are many instances in this book that I could talk about as being the ipsissima verba, the actual words of James. But there was one phrase on, and I'm quoting the page numbers again, just to prove to you I have read it all, on page 165, which summed up for me James and the milieu that he's in the Centre for Catholic Studies in Durham. And it's this, and it's a throwaway remark. It's a very in-house joke, but it gets it, I think, spot on what this book is about and its handling of these themes. And he says, he's talking about a bunch of sisters who are trying to make a choice of a confessor. And he says this: apparently, says James, Gallican Paris was a safer bet than the Jesuit-riddled Spanish Netherlands. And for me, that kind of familiarity with his sources, that ability to joke, and if I shut my eyes, I could see James Kelly in an unspecified and unknown pub somewhere in Durham, making a quip like that. I think a really, really good book, a really, really good work of objective history is also shot through with the personality of its author and with a respect and love, in the best sense of the word, for his subjects. And James, I think you have achieved that very, very well. And many congratulations to you on this wonderful achievement. Thank you.
We now have some time for a bit of conversation, and I'd like to begin by inviting John McCafferty to ask James a question, I think, but feel free, people, to put in questions that you have for James or John or Caroline through the chat function as they begin to talk.
Okay, James, I can't help, this is the first time I've ever been involved in the launch of a book about English history. So I can't help asking you the question that's on my mind. You have a thing in, I think it's from Rouen, from the English Poor Clares in 1668, And it says that the nuns are looking, I think, for a confessor. And it says, Mother Abbess was forced to beg Mr. Mailer, an Irish priest, to assist us. He was one who lived in this town. She would never want to make use of him till this present time of dire necessity. He being a person in the community we're worried about, both in regard of his being an Irishman and for several other reasons that might give them difficulty. So what I would like to ask you about is English nuns, Irish priests, how does that go?
Well, luckily I can stop in 1800, so I don't need to get into the controversial part of that story as well. But the well, as you said, there's difficulty, and I think what's interesting is how when the conventual movement is starting, and they're all starting around the same time, the end of the 16th century, start of the 17th century, and all the colleges of the Scottish and the Irish as well, and how at that early point you see some sort of collaboration. So you yourself know with like the Irish Franciscans in Louvain actually say mass in the English Augustinian cloister there, because they don't have their own chapel. And so that's what they do. They have mass there and they work together till they have their own house. But what's marked is as you go further along in the period is how that quickly breaks down. And, you know, I was thinking when you were saying you were using the Rouen Port Clare example, but perhaps, and taking it away from the Irish side and looking at the Scottish side is what the Paris Augustinians do. That the Paris Augustinians are under the authority of the bishop, the Archbishop in Paris, and he's a bit busy. So he asks, will the priest, Lewis Innes from the Scots College, which is actually next door to the convent, will he act as extraordinary superior to just check what's happening? And they really don't like this. Now there's an element, Innes is supposed to be a Jansenist, but we won't get into Jansenism as well, that maybe he was a bit harsh on them. But they actually go anywhere rather than have him as their external supervisor or external superior. And they even break what they've done. So the Paris Augustinians work with the English secular clergy. That's who they're close to. That's what they're founded. They're co-founded almost together, that it will be, the secular clergy will look after them. But they don't want him. And they even end up to the point where they get some French Benedictines to help. And then they go to the English Benedictine congregation. And they go to Benedictine monks. And it's almost as if anything, even a Benedictine monk is better than a non-English person by this stage, that they'll break their own, if you like, founding ethos. And I guess if we're being a bit more serious about it, I suppose what it shows is that in that initial burst of Catholic reform, which they're all being formed in, they're all part of this big movement, perhaps its strength is that it has this burst, but then its weakness is that it is defined nationally. So where they start at first, they'll work together. By this stage, they're in their silos, and there will be some bits toing and froing, but actually by then they're almost probably in competition as well to an extent, for all sorts of backing with the local communities and so on. And so what starts as a strength probably ends up as a weakness, I think is fair to say, as you know, they progress through the period.
Yeah, well, that's great. Thanks very much, James.
Caroline, did you have a question for James?
Can I just add to that? Mary-Louise Coulihan has written about this question about the Irishness in the convent, and you know, she found a question about whether somebody was half Irish, whether that made it easier to deal with than if you were wholly Irish. So you know, it is a recurring trope, I think we use the word. Yeah. So my question was to James. This was one interesting account. You know, at the beginning of the foundations, when they have so many arguments going along, disputes about confessors or superiors and to whom they owed allegiance, whether to the bishop as superior or to the convent. And I was thinking about the Gravelines Port Clares, and you were very generous, and you said when they have disputes with the clergy, that's often because it's a difficult relationship to work out, and there isn't an occasion of a gender war. But I was thinking of Gravelines, where there is Father Christopher Davenport, the Franciscan, who decides that he knows what's best for the nuns, and he arrives with what they describe in their history as an army of friars, locks up the nuns, and the only way they can get a message out to be saved is through a hole in the wall. It seems to me that Father Davenport perhaps he could be accused of sort of gender warfare on this occasion. He wants to impose the will of the monks, the friars, sorry, on the poor Clares. Do you think that that's the case, or am I misreading it? What do you think?
I think that what I might have been trying to do something there. That what I would say, I wouldn't discount gender, and especially in the Davenport incident, is quite vicious, as you well know, with what's going on. And I think what I wanted to do was slightly to change the angle on how we look at them. That I'm not arguing necessarily that gender wasn't an impact in it, because it will have been part of it, and there will have been overtones of it. But I think what I wanted to do is resituate it, that rather than that being our go-to reason for why these things happen, is to look broader. And if you look across the Catholic Reformation in Europe, you can find male communities having the same experiences, where they'll be quite vicious and fighting over things, and mirroring what before, when they might have been mentioned, have been called gender things, but actually it's happening on the male side, between male ones as well. And so what I was doing, and I might have over-egged it slightly, is I wanted to represent the nuns, if you like, within the Catholic Reformation, and not to see them as a bolt-on. Yeah, that they're strong enough. They're not, they're not victims, but they're strong enough to represent themselves. And to see that they are part and process of this Catholic Reformation, to recontextualize them within that. And so it's not just about the gender warfare, and although there will be gender tones, as I say, within it, but it's part of that wider thing. And I suppose, and this is me thinking off the top of my head, I wonder if part of this, and why it happens, and happens to such a degree, particularly in this English example, is that we've got the problem of implementing something, i.e. the Catholic Reformation, but without any of the structures in which it was envisaged it would be implemented. So you've got Davenport thinking, I'm the kingpin, I'm the head of the newly formed English Franciscan friars, and he says, oh, and we should always care for the nuns who fall under our remit as well, even though they've been founded before him. And of course, the good thing with those arguments that you see in this case as well, is that the English women religious know their rights, and they call on their right of enclosure to fight them off, which is brilliant, that they know exactly where they stand, and they use those same Tridentine rules, the same rules have been promulgated back against those ones trying to do that stuff, which is brilliant, but also shows, as I said, and what I wanted to show, that they aren't just meekly accepting stuff hitting upon them. They're strong, they know what they're supposed to be doing, and they also know what other people are supposed to be doing in relation to them. They're not just meekly accepting whatever happens.
No, that's true. That's true. Thank you.
Thanks. We've got some fascinating questions in the chat, and we've got only 11 minutes left because kind of committed to ending at the time we said we would end. So I'll just clump a few together. There's a few geographical questions, James. So we've heard about the Irish and the Scottish, but what about the Welsh? Hannah asks, are they part of the picture? Why so much in northern France and the Low Countries was another geographical question. And this is not quite a geographical question, but I'll throw a third one in there so you can answer if you like. What did people back in England, this is from Mary McHugh, what did people back in England think about these convents on the continent? And what did non-Catholics back in England think about them? So there's a few questions for you, and I'll come back with another one or two if you can get through those. And
yep, right, I'll move fairly quickly, which is good. So you've left me off the hook that I don't have to go into too much detail answering these, Karen. So, I don't want to disappoint people with their questions. So the first thing is, yes, the Welsh are involved. Jurisdictionally, England and Wales are linked together, and there are quite significant Welsh clusters, actually, like the Mostins, for example, and from the borderlands between England and Wales. I suppose Wales was on the back foot because of something that happened at the English College in Rome, even before these were started. They're effectively booted out and then allowed back in slowly. What I would say on the broader thing is that Welsh Catholicism, from the break with Rome right up to the modern period, with what we're doing at the moment, is in desperate need of research. It's fair to say. And so I would encourage people to be doing that. I know exactly who that question came from, and Hannah is one of those who's doing that work at the moment. So that does need doing. Why Northern France and the Low Countries? There is an element, I saw partly come up there, that it is because it's where it's the closest. There's an element with that. Now, it's the closest not just because of going there, but also in terms of coming back. That when they start, they think they are ready, and they think they're going to be coming back when Catholicism returns to England. And so, if you like, they're there because they're ready to go, and because also of transport routes and the routes that they go along and how they're getting there. Don't forget, these early modern women aren't supposed to be traveling at this stage, you know, when we're talking about in this period, that they're going there. And also it's about who will host them. So you get the first clusters are really big in the Low Countries, in the Spanish Netherlands, and that's because of the Spanish backing of the English Catholic mission. As France becomes the Catholic superpower, you begin to find them founding more in France, but they're a bit different than what comes before. The one exception is the Bridgetines, who settle in Lisbon, but they're the only one outside that cluster. Otherwise, they're all in northern France and in Spanish Netherlands, what we call Belgium today. And finally, what did people think of convents in England? Now, there's been some recent research on this, but perhaps one of the most famous examples is some of the scurrilous writing that was done for a popular audience by someone called Thomas Robinson about the Bridgetines. And he appealed to a lowest common denominator. So you've probably all seen Blackadder, or at least you will have done if you're my age anyway, and you'll have seen things about tunnels going down under the ground so that priests can go and have relationships with nuns. Thomas Robinson saying all that stuff. You know, Thomas Robinson would have the male side of the Bridgetines being absolute geniuses architecturally, that they can do all sorts of things. So we have that scurrilous element. But what's interesting, and what came out in the Nuns Project, is you begin to see non-Catholic children going to the convent schools as we get into the 18th century and more. And that's because of things like the academic excellence. So, yep, they're used for anti-Catholic machinery, if you like. But I just end by saying that the nuns are well able to turn that to their own advantage. And this is Caroline's work, that if we take the example of Mary Knatchbull, who is the abbess at the Ghent Benedictines, that she basically turns over the convent mailbag to the Stuart court in exile for who will become Charles II during the Civil War, and basically almost plays a certain level of misogyny and discrimination against the convents, against themselves, that nobody bothers looking in a convent mailbag. And so what she effectively has is a diplomatic mailbag, where she simultaneously gives Charles money and gives him advice. So a hugely influential figure, but again, well able to play off all the perceptions and popular ideas about her.
Thanks, James. That was very efficient, and I'm going to toss some more questions at you with 7 minutes, but there was going to be one about spies, but it sounds like you've come pretty close to that. People were asking about issues around spies and turncoats in convents. There's a question about whether you found much evidence of the Catholic Enlightenment in these convents, since they were they're talked about in relation to French and Italian convents, I guess. And another interesting question about, is there a kind of tension between saying that the English nuns had a peculiar proclivity towards enclosure and saying they were much more integrated into the wider European Catholic scene than people suppose? How do those two things work? That's a question for either you or Caroline. That might be enough to manage in your remaining time, I think, although there are lots more interesting questions that you can look at afterwards.
So, well, I can deal with one of them quite quickly. The Catholic Enlightenment question is that my colleague Cormac Begerden is finding out brilliant things about the canons of the Holy Sepulchre in Liège, and I don't want to spoil, you know, what he's found out. But the short answer would be that yes, they are affected. They are being influenced, some of them, by the Catholic Enlightenment and its thinking. On a really kind of basic level, they're also influenced by it if they're in the, as I said, what becomes Belgium, because they're influenced by Enlightenment laws coming in. So, for example, delays on profession and things like that. But on the intellectual level, as I said, you're going to have to wait for Cormac's work. I don't want to steal his thunder, even though I'm tempted to, I won't do. On the enclosure issue, about them being integrated with their neighbours, but also sticking with enclosure. I think the best way to see it, or at least is how I understood it, and so it is that the English women religious see enclosure as their marker. It doesn't mean, enclosure doesn't mean that they're fully cut off from what's going on around them. I think what became apparent really as we were doing the project and with the book is that they do have to have relations. And this is often done through things like the chapel. So Caroline showed the Bruges Augustinian Chapel, which got a lot of visitors when it opened because of what it looked like. But what I think is perhaps the most interesting thing about enclosure is how they're using it as almost like a badge. So England might be on the peripheries of the Catholic Reformation, but English women religious know how to do enclosure. And so you find English women religious almost using it as they almost become missionaries for enclosure. You find them actually visiting other convents to show them how to do enclosure. So this is partly what I was getting at when I was saying about, you know, they didn't just receive what was being done to them. We see them shaping the Catholic Reformation within their communities as well, and moving about in that way. So that's a really quick one on that.
That's great. In that case,
Caroline, I think just has one.
Oh yes, Caroline.
Just add a couple of sentences to reinforce what James says. Is because enclosure is very, very hard to do, and so therefore you show the quality of your religious life by the way that you can manage it, and it's embracing Trent and the regulations of Trent. So you establish your reputation, but as James says, that they need and they do, and they welcome contacts. And for example, the Bruges convent knew people in their area, so they helped to look after them when times were hard, and in turn their neighbors looked after them too. And so the enclosure is porous. I know we've got Elizabeth Leyfeld, but her work on Spain really started people thinking about what enclosure means. And we find, I think we found that the English convents both know how to go out of enclosure while keeping the rule about it, and also they embrace it. And although it seems like oppositional, it's not. It's very carefully managed.
I think we might have time for just one more question. I'd like to have a question from Sister Joyce Mayer. Could you actually ask the question yourself, Sister Joyce? It would be nice to have the voice in public of one sister, particularly with the question you're about to ask before we finish off this evening.
Okay, James, first of all, I'm eager to read the book. I have not had much experience with it yet. But anyway, my question has to do with gender. Like often, and I don't know if this was, from what your other comments were, you probably didn't address much about gender, but so often nuns are seen as kind of ungendered. And so I was wondering how that would have played out in that context, or if you found that this was true. It's like often we're not connected with the regular women, lay women of the world. Even today, we're kind of set aside as sisters. And so I'm just curious about that.
That's actually quite a difficult, quite a difficult question, actually. I suppose, I don't think they ungender them. Would be my instinct, because of like what Caroline alluded to, of what happened at the Poor Clares. And I suppose I perhaps flip it round and look at it slightly differently from how they present themselves. And that's what they're self-consciously doing. So although they're enclosed, these convents we're talking about, a great deal of them, probably about 2/3, have schools. Now, some of them, the schools are aimed at perpetuating, if you like, life of the convent, but others are very deliberately teaching young women. Okay, now that changes as the period goes on, and so when we get to the Enlightenment, how they're doing it. And they're self-consciously doing that, and everybody knows they're doing that. I.e. that you have priests bringing girls for education to the continent. So in that sense, they're recognizing that what they're doing is part of, is gendered in that sense, but is also part of the English Catholic mission. Because of course, again, this is another way, when I was talking about, turning the rules back against themselves, that these girls, when they're being educated, are not supposed to be there, but when they go back to England, they of course have their own children, and they bring them back Catholic. They bring them up Catholic. Women run the household, not the men. So the women are in charge of that household. And they also, it's a great means of bringing in different thought, if you like, from Europe that's coming back. Comes with these women, these young girls who then return will do that. And as I said, what I'm getting at is that's very conscious. So it's a female aspect of the mission. They know they're doing it. And the schools and the clergy know they're doing the schools for young women. And we know, there's always talk about what the male schools are doing, the equivalent. So like at Dowie, which is now Ushaw, or at St. Homer's, which is now Stonyhurst. But very deliberately, they are pioneering female education. So I mentioned, for example, I mentioned on the front cover, Mary Asher Joseph Wright. Newhall becomes a major Catholic school in England. They bring it back with them. It's the same with the Mary Ward sisters, which we haven't talked about, with their schools as well. And as I said, this is all a kind of roundabout way of answering you, because what's quite a tough question. But off the top of my head, it's probably the best way I can think of saying that they acknowledge what they're doing, they know what they're doing. And on the bigger scale, that's what they're pioneering. That it really is what they're doing is pioneering. They are educating young women. It might not be the education that we would know now, but this is the start of looking to do that. Does that make sense?
Yes, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I'd still like to see connection, like from the women's point of view of how they saw the sisters. Because when I think of today, even, so often women's organizations don't really connect with sisters' organizations. It's like they're two separate lines of being. And so that's kind of where my question is coming out of.
No, I do see.
Thanks.
No, I think what hopefully is good, Sister, is you've given someone else a research question to tackle that might be beyond me slightly.
Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you, James, for a great set of answers. Thank you all to the questions. I'm sorry that we haven't been able to get to them all, but timing is quite important on Zoom, as we all know. So I will draw things to a close here with a few thanks to IMEMS and Stephen Taylor for coming along, to Teresa Phillips, who's been hosting this, and Greg Ryan, who's been helping, and all who helped coordinate it. Thanks to all of you for coming and making it a great event, and helping to, perhaps anybody who has a glass might like to raise a glass or a mug or anything to toast James's fantastic new book. Thank you so much to John and Caroline for making this a really celebratory event for us. Thank you so much for coming.